Hi everyone and welcome to episode 2 of Games I Got Rid of and Why. So this is a simple series explaining why games left my collection, because they leave for many reasons, such as being replaced by other games or just not being fun to me anymore, or simply just not being a good game. So let's get started with Bang the Dice game. So this is a social deduction game with a bit of Yahtzee involved, as you are playing the roles of either a sheriff, the sheriff deputies, outlaws or renegades, and the idea is, depending on which team you're on, you want to be the winner by eliminating the opposition. The game has this Yahtzee style where you have a bunch of dice and you're rolling the dice, trying to shoot other players to eliminate them, trying to heal yourself up and so on. But the social deduction comes in because only the sheriff is public knowledge and everybody is trying to kind of bluff to each other what team they're on, trying to get on the sheriff's good side because the sheriff's a little bit more powerful, to ultimately at the end reveal themselves as the outlaw and try to murder the sheriff and be the winner. Really cool concept, I love the idea of it, but for me, after repeated plays, because I did play this one quite a lot, it stayed in my collection for many years actually, I started to notice that some of the roles weren't quite as balanced as I would like them to be. For example, I thought the renegade was in a very difficult position in terms of winning, and I played this game 20 plus times and the renegade never won once, and I thought that's just not good enough really for a game to stay in my collection. I want everybody to have a fair shot of winning, and that kind of gave a bit of stigma to this game, which meant it never got back to the table after I noticed that. Next up, I have Batman the Animated Series, Almost Got Him. This one is a very unknown game, to be honest, not popular at all. It's another social deduction game, as you are playing this game of poker, all these supervillains are, and one person amongst all these players is secretly Batman in disguise, and then you are basically, depending on which role you get and which character you get, you can collect certain poker hands and activate certain powers to try and wean out who Batman is, or try to eliminate your opponents. It's another cool concept that, it sounds cool from the face of it, but it was a game that was quite convoluted, very hard to explain, especially for a game that required a lot of players to enjoy, the most out of it. Obviously, you had to naturally involve less experienced players to play those kind of games, and it was just too much for them to learn, too many rules, too many exceptions, and it was a bit too regimented as well. And additionally, on top of all of that, the game required a dealer who wasn't actually involved in the game, just had to moderate the game, which I don't think really people want nowadays. I think most of these social deduction games do without that, and that's for the best, to be honest. So a game that wasn't quite up to scratch, which is a shame because the idea was quite cool. Next up, I have Between Two Castles of Mad King Ludwig. Now, this was quite a game that came out of nowhere for me and just piqued my interest because I'm a big fan of the Castles of Mad King Ludwig, and I always wanted to play Between Two Cities. And this one is a mashup between those two, where you are drafting tiles and trying to build castles with each of your neighbours. So you're drawing two tiles, and you're discussing and negotiating with your I suppose opponents and / teammates to determine where you're going to place which tile and where, and you're going to score lots of points in different ways depending on the alignment of rooms and combinations and so on. A cool concept again. I like the idea of having to negotiate with your opponents, but ultimately I thought the scoring was a bit too convoluted in this one. There was too many options, and ultimately I think you could always end up playing something that was just okay, and there wasn't much differentiate and much interesting choice. I also found that the production was a slight issue. The tiles were very small and the iconography was very hard to read and so on. So those small issues just didn't keep it above that threshold to make it a keeper for me. It was just okay. So next up, I have The Big Score, which actually is a game that I consider a bit of a hidden gem, and a game that I speak quite highly of to this day. This one is a card drafting game and a push your luck style game, as you are basically taking the role of these bank robbers, trying to make this big heist to get as much money as you can. The game is divided into two very distinct phases. The first one being a card drafting game, as you are drafting cards and then blind bidding on these different locations, trying to make these smaller robberies and get points that way. And the second half of the game is where you are all diving into this big bank, drawing tokens one at a time, and trying to get as much loot as you can and not get caught by the cops. Really cool game, works well, probably takes about 45 minutes to play, which is quite nice for this one. Ultimately for me, the only reason why this didn't stay in the collection was because not long after this one, I ended up picking up Push by Prospero Hall, and for me that was a much purer pushy luck style game that really got to the crux of that pushy luck a lot quicker than The Big Score did. So not really a fault of The Big Score, but I said it was kind of replaced by a much simpler, a much more elegant, and a lot, I think, fundamentally more fun game in Push. Next up, I have Blue Lagoon, which is a somewhat of a modern classic by Rainer Knizia, who is a fantastic designer. This one is a spin on one of his older titles called Through the Desert, as you are placing tiles on or tokens onto the board, trying to score points in lots of different directions, such as collecting sets of different items, kind of trying to connect all the islands together, trying to get the majorities in the islands. An ultra elegant game where all you do is just place a token on your turn. Really like it. Absolutely cannot fault the design and the stream back elegance of this game. Fantastic. For me though, after a few plays, the real abstract nature of it started to shine through, and I have a very limited capacity for my tolerance for abstract games. I don't tend to get a lot of joy out of them. And what I did initially with Blue Lagoon, and I still do, it just didn't have that fun factor for me to keep going back to it, which is a shame really, because I can objectively look at this game and say, you know what, this is a rock solid design, and I would recommend this to a lot of people. So slightly more of a personal taste on this one that prevented it from staying in my collection long term. Next up, I have Burano. Now, Burano is an interesting one, a relatively heavy and involved Euro-style game with some pretty neat concepts, as you are placing these building blocks onto the board, trying to score points in different ways and build different layers. It has a real nice table presence and 3D aspect puzzle nature to it. But for me, the reason why this one didn't stay in the collection was because the rules overhead was quite involved, and most of the games in my collection, especially these heavier Euro-style games, don't get played ultra regularly. You know, I often have to relearn the rules again and again. And I thought that this one, that rules overhead was just a little bit higher than average, and the game wasn't quite strong enough to outweigh that obstacle of me having to learn the rules again and again each time I played it. It was a solid game, and one that I think is a little bit underrated, to be honest. But the fact that the rules weren't very intuitive and, as I said, quite involved was just a bit of a hindrance to me. I just know for a fact it wouldn't have got played very often at all, maybe once every few years. So just wasn't quite strong enough and just a little bit too convoluted for me. Next up, I have Burgle Bros. Now, Burgle Bros is another cool concept where you are working together. So it's a purely cooperative game where you are trying to do this big bank heist by working together, navigating through the different floors, avoiding the security guards, cracking safes and so on, and trying to escape through the roof. Really cool game. It works well. It has a nice AI in terms of the way the guards move around move around the floors in like a kind of grid reference style manner. Liked it. Really liked this one. Quite thematic. For me though, the reason why this one ended up leaving the collection was, number one, it didn't get played very often. Number two, the game is extremely hard to beat, very difficult. And when we eventually did beat the game, it was great moment. The luster of it started to wear off quickly, and I think a lot of these games that are extremely difficult, once you do crack that code and do beat the game, I think that incentive to go back and do it again is diminished massively. And that was the case with Burgle Bros, for me at least. Next up, I have Byzanz. Byzanz is a small card game, a trading style game, as you are trying to bid on these different lots of objects using the same cards in your hand. So you're actually bidding on objects using objects. This game had some pretty unique and innovative ideas where when you would bid for things, you'd actually put the cards that you bid with in a separate lot at the end of the game, ready for taking by the player who ended up taking the least goodies in the round. So it had this real kind of interesting catch-up mechanism where if you didn't do too well in the bidding phase, you could end up picking up cards, or at least the most valuable stack of cards. You get priority in doing so. So that was quite cool. It had this nice flow to it. For me though, while I did enjoy this while I played it, I thought it was quite a bit innovative, it has some quite cool concepts. Certainly got some mileage out of this one. I thought that there's a few too many these style games that are out there that do this slightly better than this one. Can't really fault it other than that really. It just didn't quite have that appeal and that hook to keep you going back to it after a while. So that was why Byzanz left the collection. Next up I have Camel Up. Now, Camel Up is very much a mainstay in my collection for many, many years, and ultimately that's what, you know, diminished the value of it to me, because the more and more I played it, the less and less I wanted to play it again. So I played this one probably close to 20 times, which is quite a lot for me personally. And I think once you've played it, you've kind of seen everything it needs to do, and the fun factor just wasn't quite there for me at the end of it. I'll still play this now. You know, it's a real fun betting style game as these camels are racing and stacking on each other and carrying each other across the race, trying to weigh up all the different variables and bet on the best camels. Really cool concept, nice fun game, really nice family weight game that plays pretty quickly. But again, once you play things 20 plus times, they start to become a bit repetitive and a bit samey. And that was the case for Camel Up. So massive props for actually staying on the table that many times, but no desire to go and play it now. Next up, I have Captain Sonar, which is probably one of my most polarising games, not only by the people I've played it with, but also by myself, because this one is a team versus team game, basically a game of battleships, as you are both teams are commanding a submarine, one being the captain and you know, steering the different directions, one person trying to track the other ship, one person trying to keep all your systems afloat, and one person kind of using the weapons and stuff. Really, really good game, really nice, well designed at least. It's, in fact, genius the way everything comes together. The problem was with this game, to get the most out of it, you have to play it with at least 6 or 8 players, that being 3 or 4 aside. And the fact that every role in this game is so different meant that when you explained it to new players, you had to basically explain 4 different games. And that became a massive burden, and it became a bit too much of a chore to teach to people. And not only that, when the game actually got rolling, unless you were playing with people who were really committed to the game, really wanted to play the game to the most kind of maximum effect, it would really much fall on its ass. Far too chaotic, because it was a real-time game. You know, everybody would play things at the same time, shouting over each other, very hard to govern, and it just ended up breaking down one too many times for me. I can see the novelty of it. I would play this again under the right circumstances, but it was never going to get out again in my game group, at least. It didn't go down too very well, and I said, one of the most hit or miss games that I've ever played. So when it works really well, but when it doesn't work, it really does fall flat. And finally, for this episode, I'm going to be talking about Carcassonne. Carcassonne, a game I cannot speak badly of. One of the games that really got me into this hobby. A tile placement game, as you are drawing a tile from a bag and expanding roads or castles or fields, trying to get points by building bigger castles, bigger roads, and connecting all the castles together on those fields. Classic, most people have played this game. For me though, it got replaced by slightly more involved games, more specifically Isle of Skye. I thought Isle of Skye just has that slightly next level of complexity that I enjoy, while I can still introduce it to new players. Yes, it's slightly less intuitive and slightly less approachable than Carcassonne. But for me, that reason, I would never go back to Carcassonne. The reason that Carcassonne stayed in my collection for such a long time was because I always played this with my girlfriend. It was one of my go-to games. But when I got Isle of Skye, she equally got that one. She took that one in quite well and started to enjoy that one more. So as soon as that happened, Carcassonne was void for me, and ended up getting rid of it, because while it's nice to have a game to have in your collection to introduce new players, I don't play with a lot of new players all the time, so for that reason it was just taking up space. So that's 11 games for this episode. I hope there's some interest here, and I'll keep doing this one because the last videos seem to go down quite well. If you have enjoyed the video, please hit like and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future episodes of this. And for everyone else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye.